When John Brown was led from his cell to be hanged by the neck until dead on December 2nd, 1859, he passed a scrap of paper to his guard. John Brown had been convicted of treason by the state of Virginia, the first such conviction in American history, in a show trial. Treason referred to how Brown organized a group of armed citizens who raided the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the intention of starting a mass insurrection, an uprising against the institution of slavery, and by extension, the entire political economic system that defined the United States. The handwritten folded note asserted that the guilt was not his, but rather guilt permeated the entire nation, a nation corrupted by the filthy institution of slavery. The note read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." His words were prescient in a sense that few understood. His contemporaries and future historians bent over backwards to describe him as a madman and to dismiss his raid as a folly. Now that we see before our eyes the employment of COVID-19, lockdowns, masks, quarantine camps, vaccine mandates, and other institutions that are intended to reduce us all but a handful of the super rich, the planter class of our age, to reduce us all to slavery, we must ask ourselves, exactly what did John Brown do, and why was the reaction of the establishment against him so severe? For those who are absolute pacifists, listen no more about John Brown. The rest of you, please listen closely. John Brown had been fighting against slavery since 1848, and his activities in Kansas included explicit violence in opposition to the horrid institution of slavery. He spent 2 years preparing for the uprising that would start and end at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His invitation to action was turned down by most everyone, including the leading anti-slavery figure, Frederick Douglass, who considered it too dangerous and too provocative. That raid, that decision to resolve the issue of slavery by force, no matter how small the numbers of people involved in the group, made John Brown an extremist because he undermined the progressive cause of ending slavery through negotiation and through compromise. But John Brown's logic was impeccable, and his contemporaries had to ignore what he wrote in order to dismiss him. Frederick Douglass himself would come to agree with Brown's position. The nature of slavery, just like the true nature of lockdowns, masks, and vaccines, had been intentionally suppressed and avoided by progressive politicians and intellectuals who wanted to debate heatedly the policy process, but not the nature of slavery. Slavery, according to Brown, was not a mistaken policy, nor a peculiar institution distinctive to the South, nor a matter of states' rights or of property rights, and not an issue that could be worked out through compromise. No, John Brown made it clear in his writings that the people, that slavery, like the vaccines, was a war against the people and that people must respond in kind to this assault as they would respond to a war. His actions were attacked at the time by Democrat and Republican alike, but he galvanized the nation when he revealed a hidden, horrid truth by charging madly into the horns of common sense. Frances Ellen Watkins, a freed slave and abolitionist, sent a letter to John Brown in prison reading, "Dear friend, although the hands of slavery throw a barrier between you and me, and it may not be my privilege to see you in the prison house, Virginia has no bolts or bars through which I dread to send you my sympathy. In the name of the young girl sold from the warm clasp of a mother's arms to the clutches of a libertine or profligate, in the name of the slave mother, her heart rocked to and fro by the agony of her mournful separations, I thank you that you have been brave enough to reach out your hands to the crushed and blighted of my race. Your martyr grave will be a sacred altar upon which men will record their vows of undying hatred to that system which tramples on man and bids defiance to God." Brown did what other anti-slave forces, the Robert Malones and the Naomi Kleins of today, were afraid to do. He insisted that words alone, protests alone, would not work. It was a war, and dedicated institutions, organizations of men ready to die for the cause, was the only means of real resistance. Brown drafted in 1858 a Declaration of Liberty that extended the Declaration of Independence to its full logical conclusion of freedom for all Americans. The Declaration of Liberty rewrote the Declaration of Independence to cover all races, men and women, without exception. Quote, "That when any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter, amend, or remodel it, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them seem most likely to affect safety and happiness of the human race, to secure equal rights, privileges, and justice to all, irrespective of sex or nation, to secure fraternal kindness for all friends of equal moral privileges, to all who honestly abandon their despotic, oppressive rule." He and his followers also drafted a provisional constitution for the United States that laid down the logical, ethical, and legal justifications for the raid at Harper's Ferry. He explained that the cancer of society had rendered the United States so corrupt and its policies so distant from the word and the spirit of the Constitution that it lacked the legitimacy that it required. The new Constitution presented a blueprint for the rule of law, and his actions were entirely unjust from the point of view of the position articulated, and they foreshadowed the efforts of Reconstruction. We watch today the horrific final stages of the decay of civilization and of the rule of law in the United States, a decay that has allowed COVID-19 to fester and to blossom. COVID-19 has taken the place of slavery as a weapon that cowardly intellectuals cannot name, a weapon that is deployed in the war against citizens. COVID-19 regulations, cooked up in secret by consulting firms funded by the rich, are fed through a shadowy network to the pathetic politicians who rubber stamp them then and then appear on television to justify them to the public. This COVID-19 regime has entirely replaced the Constitution in the same sense that the radical expansion of slavery in the 1850s gutted constitutional guarantees and opened the door for the transformation of all working-class Americans into slaves at that time. Brown's Provisional Constitution identified the true nature of slavery as, quote, none other than the most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another portion. The war against the people today, the campaign to make us all slaves, is made possible by the denial and by the embrace of falsehood, and by the treason of the intellectuals who value their status and their retirement funds more than the pursuit of truth or commitment to moral values. The false, limited hangout critics of COVID-19 suggest that posting something witty on social media sources like Facebook, Twitter, etc. is an act of defiance. But these sources, as well as Wikipedia or YouTube, are not even public platforms, but rather controlled by multinational corporations whose ultimate purpose is to allow you, to allow me, and to encourage you to complain to your friends, but to take no actions that could lead to fundamental institutional, financial, or ideological change. We must not enter the dead-end tunnel of moral outrage for the like-minded, aimed not at painful change through sacrifice, but rather self-importance. As Thomas Garrig Masaryk put it, we observe today, quote, egotism hidden under the mask of humanity and nobility in mind, cowardice passing itself off as fortitude, sophistry deceiving the sensible and the wise. John Brown may not be the appropriate model for this particular historical juncture, but his decision to act rather than to debate speaks volumes. As the billionaires use supercomputers and complex algorithms to induce mass psychosis, fear and passivity, narcissistic obsessions with images, sex, and food, as the first steps are taken to create a permanent slave class at home and abroad, we must see the actions of John Brown or of Spartacus, who led that famous slave revolt in Rome, with new eyes. It may be far worse this time. While the trashy media continues to suggest the COVID-19 pandemic will be over in a few months, we need to consider seriously the other possibility. As Plato once said, only the dead have seen the end of war. Perhaps the proper revision for our age would be, only the dead have seen the end of this pandemic. Once you put it that way, the solution becomes crystal clear.